green grass and rolling hills were the visual hallmark of the Framer Spring event. Curious how we made them? Let's dive into Cinema4D and Redshift to see how. So here we are in Cinema4D, and I already have a scene set up with some objects from Quixel Megascans. Now these are scanned real-world objects so that we can get the greatest fidelity in our renders. And they've created a plugin which lets you use these objects in Cinema4D with materials already applied. And you can see I have one type of grass called tundra grass down here. And then I have another type of grass called kikuyu grass, which has a soft kind of look to it. And then I have these white wildflowers. I think there's a different name for these, but I've renamed it because it was hard to recognize. So let's focus here on this kikuyu grass. I'll turn my other objects off, and you can see what we're working with here. Now I have a wind object that's applied to this. Now in the scenes that we used for the Framer Spring event, there was some subtle motion in the grass. And to achieve this, we didn't use any kind of physics simulations. We used a wind deformer. Now, a wind deformer, we can see if we play our timeline here, that it causes the grass to kind of like wave and move like there's wind blowing. But this is too dramatic. There's the bottoms of them move. Grass doesn't move like this. So we have, if we look at the wind object on the right-hand side, I created a field, a linear field. And what this does, we'll zoom out here so you can see what's going on. You can see that there's this linear field which starts from 0 at the bottom and goes to 1 at the top. So that means that the wind deformer will be as 0% at the bottom and at 100% at the top. So when we play it with this linear field activated, and we zoom back in, we can see that the motion is much more natural. Like the wind is blowing just the grass just a little bit. And when we have a ton of it scattered, this wind will have variation across our entire scene. And when we turn our other objects back on, you can kind of see as we play this that all of it has some subtle motion, some of it a little bit more dramatic than others. Like this particular piece of grass, we could probably tone down a little bit so that it doesn't move so much at the bottom. And I'm just moving that linear field up so that the bottom doesn't move as much. So we have some nice movement. So now it's time to scatter our grass. So to begin scattering our grass, we're going to create a plane object. And this will serve as the base for our landscape. And we're going to scale this up to something like 2000 by 2000. And then we can see, we zoom out, that there's a large area that this takes up. And this is what we want. Next, we're going to add a displacer object. Now you can find this in this deformers menu, but I'm going to use the search to add this. So we're going to do a Shift C and type in displacer. And if you double click on it, it creates it in the scene, and you can drag it underneath your plane. Now, this doesn't do anything by default, but if you go to the shading tab and then add a noise, mathematical noise, you'll start to see some variation in this. But there's not a lot going on yet, so we need to increase the amount of displacement. So we're going to change it to something like 50. And you can start to see more variation. But it's all jagged because and we'll activate the lines so you can all see what's going on. We'll see that there's very jagged kind of displacement. That's because there's not enough geometry in this plane yet. So we're going to up it. We're going to do something like 128 by 128. And now we can see that there's a lot of displacement going on here. And it's very rough because the displacement shading, the noise, is just default scale. So what we need to do is scale this up so that it's softer. It looks more like a landscape. So as we scale this up to something like 2000%, we have something that looks more like hills, but it's still a little too even often hills kind of like stretch in one direction or the next. And you can change this by adjusting the relative scale. So let's just change this relative scale to something like 220. And we start to see that it looks more like rolling hills. And this is exactly what we want. So we'll go back to the Displacer Object tab, and we're going to change this to 100. So we want more variation or more height. And then we go back to the noise, and we can scale up this other axis to spread out these hills again to something like 200%. So now we can see that it has some nice rolling hills. We'll stretch these out a bit more to over 300%. And now, depending on the angle you look at, you'll see the hills moving in the way you want them. Now, if you don't like the way this looks by default, you can change the seed that it displaces at. So this is like the randomness value. And you can change this as many times as you want, any value, and it'll just keep going randomly through different displacement amounts or displacement equations. So we had a good look back at like 666, which is the default. And then we're going to start scattering our grass. Now we could go and use a cloner object, but I found that when you use a cloner, that the scene gets very heavy. I'll show you what happens. When you create a cloner object, it creates objects in a grid by default, but we want them to be on an object. So we select our object to scatter on as being the plane. We want to move this cloner below, and we want it to be a render instance. So let's take some of our geometry and put it into this cloner. So let's start with our kikuyu grass. Actually, we're going to take our objects for the tundra grass for this. So we'll put all three of those in the cloner. And you'll see a few of them start to show up on our plane. But if we start cranking the number up, because we need lots, like thousands of these objects. So if we do 1,000, we start to see them appear in the scene. And this is helpful because it lets you know if the object is oriented the right way. Now a cloner lets you change the transformation of an object in your scene. So if we wanted this to be a different orientation, we can rotate it. So on this RP axis, we change this to -90. And now it's automatically aligned with our plane. So that's perfect. But if we needed to like have this be like 10,000, this works. But I found that the value needs to be way higher than this. Like we start getting like 50,000. And depending on, you can start to see my frame rate is terrible for this. And we're going to be layering different scattered objects on our scene. And it just becomes too heavy to work with, especially when you start to add animations and things like that to your scene. Now, the solution to this is to not use a cloner at all. So we'll move these back to our geometry folder, and we're going to create what are known as matrix scatters. So these work kind of like a cloner, but it doesn't show you the geometry in the viewport. And these work exclusively with the Redshift renderer. There's different ones that will work with Octane. But we're going to change similar things. So we're going to change this to objects, and then we're going to go into this RS object tab, and we're going to change this to custom objects. And we're going to click on this eyedropper and then add our grass to this matrix object. Now this is where we go back to the object tag and we do similar things to it. So we're going to change this to this is the size of those little cubes. And then the object that it's cloning onto is this plane. And again, we're not going to see anything because we have it set to 20 objects, but we can change this to something like 50,000 again. And we have no issues with performance in the viewport. And then we're going to change this rotation value because remember they weren't rotated the right way. So now if we were to render this, we would see our objects properly in the scene. Now, I do have some lighting already in this scene, so if we activate our daylight object, this has a daylight HDRI from Grayscale Gorilla. Thanks, Nick and Chad. This will serve as the basis for our lighting. So I'm going to open up my startup layout, which has a render view already in it. This is the layout I use for most of my scene construction. So this is how I kind of like work usually. And we'll activate the render view here so we can see what this looks like. So we can already see that we have some nice lighting going on here because the hills block the light at certain angles and create nice shadow. But you'll notice that it's still not filled in. Despite this 50,000 grass objects, we are still having some patchiness going on. So what we'll do is we'll pause our viewport and we'll save our file. And let's create some more matrix scatters. So let's create 2 more RS matrix objects. We'll go over here, matrix scatter, we'll create 1 here, and then we'll do a control drag to duplicate it. We're going to rename this. We're going to call this grass tundra. We'll call this grass kikuyu, and we'll call this white flowers. All right. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the first one. So we're going to add the kikuyu grass to this. We'll go to the RS, RS object, and let's make our sidebar a little wider here so we can see what's going on. And we're going to change this to custom objects, and then click on our kikuyu grass, and then we'll go to the white. We don't want that one in there. So we'll do that. We'll create this, and the white wildflowers, open that folder, custom objects. We'll open these. Let's get that collapsed. And we'll add these as well. All right, so we have these created, and we'll change these as well to scatter on our object, our plane object. So these will have scattered already, and we'll have very little of them. We'll change the grass to the kikuyu grass to 50,000 again, and we'll see that they're huge, so we'll change this to 2. We need to rotate these -90 degrees as well. Same here with this one. And then we will make this one something like, let's say, 5,000 right now. And we'll change this to 2 as well. All right, so if we have these active and we activate our render view again, we'll see these start to have scattered. And you'll notice that they scatter in the exact same pattern as the tundra grass, which is not what we want. So let's select our grass kikuyu, and we'll change the seed to something else. And we'll start to see some variation with these so that it fills in space in a nice and natural way. We'll do the same thing with our flowers so that they're scattered nicely as well. And we're going to up this to 10,000. All right. So now we have some flowers scattered, and we can kind of see, like when you look at this at an angle, a lot of the space is kind of filled in with like the camera angle. But if we wanted to have like more of the space filled in, we'll have to add more objects to our scene, right? So we're going to need to take both of these grasses up to 100,000 to really start to fill in the gaps. And our render view is going to slow way down. Our viewport should be fine, but the rendering is going to take a lot more time to resolve some of these details. Now, one thing that you'll notice if we were to zoom in to this and get a closer look, that all of these are oriented the same exact way. So when you see grass in nature, it has random organic variation. So how do we get that in our grass? Well, we need to add some effectors to our grass objects. And we're going to do this by adding a random effector first. So these are found here in this effectors area. And if we have our white flowers matrix object selected and we click on this random effector, it will randomize the position by default. So if we look at our parameters, that what's happening is they're moving 50 centimeters on the X, Y, and Z axis. We don't necessarily want that. We want them to change in their rotation so that they're not moving up in space and floating. So if we activate rotation and we change this to something like 720 degrees, then we'll see a lot more variation in our objects. Next, we will apply this same random effector to the other scatters. So if we just drag this into the effectors tab, we now get a ton of variation in our scene. So we zoom out and we start to see that we have that variation that we want. And when you look at it from a distance, it looks really, really natural. And we could probably add more objects to these, but it'll slow our render way down when we're trying to fill out the details in our scene. So we'll notice that the flowers still feel like they're not like organically placed, because flowers don't grow in discrete clumps like this. They kind of grow in patches. So how do we get this in patches? Well, first we need to update up the value again. So let's change it to something like 25,000. And we'll see that it starts to fill in a lot more. But again, flowers don't grow like this. So we need to add another effector. This time we're going to add a plane effector. Now a plane effector isn't an effector for the plane object. It's an effector that affects all of the objects in a plane way. So here is by default, our effector is right here. So if we change this to plane, again, by default, it moves all the objects up on the y-axis 100 centimeters. So we change that to 0. That's great. But we need flowers to grow in some places and not in others. So to do this, we need to add a field to our plane effector. Now this we're going to use is a shader field. Now a shader field works kind of like a displacer object, where it's displacing objects with mathematical noise. So we'll add a shader with a noise, and by default nothing will happen because on our plane effector we don't have anything selected yet, or we don't have anything affected, no parameters. We're going to change the scale of our objects. So if we change this to uniform scale and we change this to -1, we'll notice that some of the objects disappear, most of them, in fact. And then what's left are very small versions. So what we want to do is dial in the detail on this on this plane effector with the shader field that acts as a mask for the effect. So we're going to disable our kikuyu and tundra grasses, and we're left with just our flowers, so we can kind of see what's happening. So let's go back into our shader. And again, this has to do with scale and contrast of our noise. So if we scale this, not seed, we scale this up, we start to see that the pattern is changing, right? And we want to change this value to have some kind of natural look, kind of like the way our hills were. So again, we scale this up, and we might need to, let's turn these other grass objects back on so we can kind of see how it looks in between. We start to see some more natural kind of looks. We had to wait for this to resolve. We can kind of see some of a patch of flowers here, which is nice, but they're not big enough. So one thing that we can do is go into our white flowers. And again, we go into our object tab, and we can change our scale to, in the transform tab, change this to 2. And this makes all of our objects bigger so that we can kind of like see them a little bit more. And we start to see, like, okay, we have some more variation, but it's still like the patches are too big. So it means we need to scale our noise a little bit differently now. So let's get this a little more dialed in. So we'll deactivate the grass again, and we'll scale this up, or scale it down, and make this a little bit more patchy. Let's see what we can do here. We want some more contrast too in our noise. We start to see as we dial in the contrast, you see how the objects kind of like are scaling as we do that. So we'll get it up to something like 70%. And we have the objects appearing in like these clusters. And the clusters are probably too big, so we can scale these down. And you look at our noise, and now it's growing in more like these patches is what we want. So we can kind of see there's a lot of variation in the scale of our objects, and we turn our grass back on, and we'll look and see how that looks. And that's probably a little bit too, the flowers are too big in relation now. So if we go back here and we change this to something like 1.5, then we get a little bit better scale. Let's make them a little bit smaller again. 1.2. All right, now we're looking pretty good. So when we view this at different angles, we'll have a little bit more natural looking grass. So beautiful. It looks nice from these angles. If we look at the above, we still have some, like, we can still see the plane beneath that. And we have a material that I can pull in from our other scene to get that plane to have some kind of like natural looking ground texture. So here is the grass material. That this is the dried grass. So again, like you want it to look like natural ground underneath. So we're going to drag this onto our plane. We're going to set it to a cubic map and do something like 10%. So if we were to turn off our scatters, we can kind of see like the same like repeating texture over and over again. And maybe that's a little bit too small, so we'll do something like 20%. And we're not going to see this, so like it's not super important, but it does fill in the detail enough that when you view it in the scene, then it looks natural. So we'll turn our scatters back on, and then we'll reactivate our viewport. So let's save our scene, turn it back on, and now some of those white patches that we're showing through now have the grass. And if we zoom like way in, like we're not really going to care that it's a little brown underneath, because that's what the ground looks like. So again, like it looks just really nice. And you'll see like in our viewport that this default, like the objects that we're cloning and scattering are visible, but in the render, they're not. That's because RS matrix scatter objects hide those objects by default. And we can simply, like, if we turn these off, if you like hide them, then they're disabled in the viewport. So you can just leave them on. They won't show up in your renders. You'll just see them in the viewport. So they kind of might get in the way. So if you want, you can like drag these like below your scene so that they are invisible. All right, so now we have our nice grassy hills, and we want to get some camera angles to make this look really nice. So let's start by creating a camera object. And I like to, when I create a camera object, to reset it. So I have this button in my UI that resets the transforms on this object. So you'll see it now in our scene because we're not using that camera as our view. So by default, an RS camera. It has 35 millimeter focal length. I like to bump this up to something like 200, which makes it more like a telephoto lens and flattens out perspective. And you get some nice depth of field in shots like this if that's the look you're going for. So now, if we activate this view, we get something that's like way close, and it's not exactly how we want it to look. So let's go to our optical tab, and we're going to, actually no, first we will create a null objects. This is what the camera will sit in, and we can use it to control and animate things. Now by default, these are going to be at the same position. So if we select our camera view and we just pull back, it's zooming out from that view and keeping us pointing at the null that we just created. So we'll call this cam null. We'll also right click on our camera object and create a target tag, which will point the camera at this camera null if we drag it into the target object. So now if we were to move, go outside of our viewport, and we'll change this to a perspective view and quick shading. So now if we change this camera view, it's always going to point at that null, which is great for animating something that's pointing at a specific object. And you can control this null with keyframes and anything that you might like. So let's go back into our camera object and the optical tab, and we're going to activate bokeh, which is depth of field. And you'll automatically see that our scene has some nice bokeh added. So if we wanted to focus on something specific, we can set it as our camera null. So then where that null sits in our scene, again, we activate this view, we can kind of see like this is where the focal point of our stuff is. So that's the way we want it. Now we want to add a bokeh map. So the way a camera lens changes light adds a little bit of chromatic aberration. So I have an object here that will serve as our bokeh map, and this is from Grayscale Gorilla. This is used as like a simulated bokeh, so it changes the RGB values a little bit. So you'll notice the fringes of the bokeh now have a little bit of interest to them. Now, one thing I'm seeing when I look at this shot is that all the grass kind of has similar scale. So again, we're going to want to add some variation to these grass objects. So we're going to select one of these, and we're going to create another plane effector. And this time the plane effector is going to change the scale of these, and we'll change it to uniform scale, and we'll change it to something like 0.5. And now we'll get some nice variation in this scale. So maybe we change it to 0.1. So there's not as much. Now we have a little bit more variation in our grass. And I believe I added this to tundra grass. So we want to add this, or no, kikuyu grass. So we'll add it to our tundra grass as well. And we get a little bit more variation in our scene. So let's zoom out our camera a bit more. If we want, we can move this around. Maybe we rotate it a bit so that we can point this in a different direction and get our hills lined up. Okay, so this is looking exactly how we want. Now you might be wondering, how do we get that fisheye kind of look? So we're going to duplicate our camera null and camera object. So we'll activate this other camera, and we're going to turn off our render view so we can play around with the cameras. So let's see. In the camera object, we change this from perspective to fisheye, and by default it sets to 180 degrees. You'll notice that you can't see our RS or our matrix scatters in our scene anymore. It's because with a fisheye camera, that kind of stuff isn't displayed, and that's fine. So we're going to look, and we don't see any kind of like controls. It's just like it doesn't distort them the way a normal camera does. So let's reset this. We'll reset this transform, and we're going to also reset the position of our camera. So now it's looking directly down at our grass. So if we wanted to make it look like one of those planet shots, we can actually zoom this camera out, and then we can also go into this fisheye and change it to like a full 360 of our grass scene, which looks wild. If we activate our render view again, we see our grassy scene as like this orb from the sky, which is a cool look. And we actually explored using this angle for some of our shots, but it loses some of the detail and appeal that the more up close views will get. So we'll deactivate our render view for now, and we're going to reposition our camera again. So we're going to reset the view, and we're going to rotate this camera so it's pointing up to the sky. So if we were to take this RS camera, let's move back to this view, and we move. How does this work? Oh, that's right. It's pointing to the null. So let's deactivate our tracker object, and then we'll rotate our camera to be pointing up directly. I think that's right, 90 degrees. And then if we look back up at our camera, we see it kind of pointing up at the grass. All right, so the reason that we're getting a black look is because it's still using this camera null as its focal point. So we need to back off the camera from the null, and then move our object down so it's resting just above the ground. Now the bokeh might need to be lessened. So if we change this to something like 24, we're going to get a little bit more clarity in our scene. And you'll start to see, like, we get a little bit of that focal point. So we want to really dial in, and we have to like micro focus like our stuff, because the changes that you make, and because the objects are so close to the lens, that it will change the values. And we want like the fisheye to be less, because we don't want like a perfectly circular. We want it to kind of like crop in. So if we change this to something like 220, we start to see it's filling the screen a little bit better. But you notice that there's like these black lines to the left and right. That's because the scale of our lens, it doesn't show things that are outside of that spherical lens. So we need to change it to something like 1.2, and we get a little bit better of a scale, and we can adjust the fisheye look. And again, you have to like really fine tune like these values to get them to look exactly right for the fisheye. So let's go and look at our bokeh again. Change this to like 32. Let's try 48. And we start to see some things come into focus. So that's perfect. So let's play around again with our distance and get that to look. Where is our focal point? I think we're getting closer. And it could be like where the focal point is not exactly it. So as we move this around, we kind of see things come into focus, but this is still too far away. So we move it closer. So it's like this push and pull of like where the focal point is. And because we can't see our objects in the scene, you have to like do a dance of getting it dialed in. So let's see here. Let's try just like changing where the focal point is. So we're going to create another null inside of this and call it the focus. And then we're going to point the focal object to this new focus object. And we can really get this now to change where the focal point is. So let's see, is it higher? Higher up? Higher up? Nope. It's closer. So I'm going to get, as we get closer, objects will start to come into focus that are like right close to the camera. And that's like what you want. So then you kind of get like this look where some stuff is in focus. And the way I animated this was I got a shot lined up and then I just moved in one position. And as it moved, like all the objects on the fringes of the view kind of are waving in the breeze, and you get this really fun kind of look. So that's like this viewed up. So the other view that I had was one where it was kind of like tilted. So again, we just take this same view and we rotate it to be kind of like from the ground, and we move it down so that it's lower in the grass. You can kind of see as we get closer to the grass, we can see everything kind of come into focus. And it just looks super cool. And you put the focus kind of like just a little bit in the distance so that you get this kind of look. And depending on how like your light is, like you might want the light to favor one side. Again, you can change this by going into your HDRI and just rotate it. And the whole thing kind of like changes. Whole view can you're really like the tone of your scene can just change a ton just by the position of the light. And you get like these really fun looks. I also had a sunrise object. So we can see that this sunrise object again, like it looks just so cool. Look, when you get the angle exactly right. And you get it like just peeking over the edge. And depending on like how you have your scene set up, you might need to like really move around where the light is hitting, which means that the position of the camera needs to change. So like if there's a hill blocking the light, like it needs to be in a different spot to see like the light hit the grass. Yeah. So again, we like move like really small movements. And you can just play around with the detail of things. Like if you don't like the way that the grass is scattered for this particular shot, you again go back into your like scatters and you change like the variables, and it's going to scatter just a little different for each time you click these, and you'll get them looking right. Again, like the flowers, you can change this, like the scattered flowers, your seed for your the way the flower patches are scattered. You change all these variables so you get like the framing that you want for your shots. So that's the basics of how we achieved these grassy scenes. We hope you appreciated this tutorial, and stay tuned for more.